Alright, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make a basic 2D game and how I set up the game project in Godot 4. So I'm going to start out and create a new project and just call it 2D game. I'm going to click browse. They have a nice little new explorer. I'm going to right click and click new folder and call it 2D game. Select folder, create and edit. Now every 2D game, every scene in a 2D game should start with a 2D node. Our main 2D node that controls everything in the game, I'm just going to call it game and then save. And I'll go ahead and click run so that I can set it as my main scene and then close it. Next, I'm going to go ahead and create a folder called scenes and a folder called scripts, and I'll move the game scene into the scenes folder. Every game has a player, so we'll go ahead and create a new scene, 2D scene, and name it player. Save that. Create another new scene and call it level, because every game has levels, and we'll use this node to generate levels. So we'll save that. Now every level has an environment, so I'll create a new scene called environment, if I can spell. Save that. And every environment is built up of something, and in this case I build my environments out of blocks, so we'll create a new scene called block. Everything in Godot is a node, and you'll kind of get the concept here after a little bit of time. So we have a game, a player, a level, an environment, and a block. I'll go ahead and move all these scenes into my scene folder. Before I get too far ahead of myself, I'm going to go into project settings and go ahead and set up my project the way I typically would set it up. I'm going to use a 1024 by 768 width and height. That's because most of my assets, which are special in this case, and I'll explain that later, are going to be 32 by 32, and that divides nice and evenly into 1024 by 768. Let's go to input map, and we'll go ahead and add some actions that we can use as input. Up, down, left, right, button 1, and button 2. Let's rename up. We did not spell that correctly. We click the plus symbol and press a key and click OK to connect a key with an action. Down, left, right. Button 1 I'll use space for now. Button 2 we'll use the F key for now. We can change these buttons later or rename them if we want. I think my settings are the way I want them now, except let's do one more thing. 2D physics, we'll add a layer called let's say environment, a layer called player, a layer called enemy, and all the way down at the bottom we'll say no interaction, and I'll explain that in another video. That concludes my project settings and mostly my project setup, but there's a few things I want to do. A game is usually built up of levels. Every level probably has an environment and a player. So we'll take the environment scene, we'll drag it onto the level. We'll take the player and we'll drag it onto the level. Now every environment is built up of, in this case, blocks. But before we move there, let's Control S to save our level. So let's move to our environment. Now our environment is going to be built of blocks. And I'll get back to this in the next video, but we'll go ahead and add a child node called tilemap, because in Godot 4 we can now use scenes as part of our tile map. I'll explain that later. But for now, let's just go ahead and create our player and our block. For a player, you have to decide, is your player going to be affected by gravity, like Mario? When you jump, you fall back down. Or is your player going to be more like they can move freely in any direction they want without being affected by gravity at all? Let's make this one more like a Mario character. So we want to add a child node called rigid body 2D. And for a rigid body 2D, it's really just like a container for other elements. And in this case, we want to have something called a collision shape 2D. And we want to give it a shape. We'll give it a circle shape. And that will be our player. But this is just a collision detection shape. The player will also need to have a visual element to it, so we're going to add another child node to rigid body called polygon 2D. So first, what we actually want to do is we'll go ahead and save our player. We'll turn on snapping, and we'll go to edit our snapping options, and we'll change our grid steps to, let's say, 2 pixels. Now we want to click on our polygon 2D and draw a player shape here. So we'll stay inside of the collision shape, and we'll just draw what is going to probably look like a stop sign. We'll change the color. Let's make it, I don't know, purple, because I like purple as a character color. We'll turn off the grid, turn off the grid, and now we have our player, which is a stop sign. That's the color purple, and we'll save the player. Notice the collision shape is outside of the boundaries of the stop sign. We can drag that in just a little bit to make it kind of even. Let's do that. That looks good. And we'll save it. So we have a player, we have a level, which consists of a player and an environment, and then we have an environment which is typically built out of blocks. I'm going to get back to that in the next video, but let's do one last thing before we end this video. Let's attach a script to every single one of these scenes that we created, because we're going to need it later. The main game script, which is going to control all of the logic of the game. The player script, which is going to control all the logic of the player. Make sure you hit save after every one of these. The level script, which is going to control the logic of the level. Save. The environment script, which will control the logic of the environment. And the block script, which will control the behavior of the block. This is typically how I set up a 2D game. There's one more thing I need to do. We need to move all of these scripts down to our scripts folder. Notice that when I open up a scene and create a script and attach it to that scene, it gets put in the same root level of that scene. So let's move all these .gd files into the scripts folder. And so we have our scenes, game is our main scene, and then we have scripts, which is basically a script for every single piece of the game. I'll go ahead and save this, and one more thing I want to do. Nope, actually there's not. I think this is good for now, and this is typically how I set up my 2D games just to start out. The only real difference that you might want to make is you might not need a character that uses a rigid body 2D. So for, like I said, a rigid body 2D, you can make gravity affect it. Well, if your character is not going to be jumping up and down like Mario and can just freely move around, you might want to use a character body 2D instead. What we can do is, you could have started out with a character body 2D, but if you didn't, you can right click, go to change type, and type in character body 2D. This used to be called a kinematic body 2D. Notice how the name has not changed. It still says rigid body 2D, but the icon is showing a character body 2D icon. So let's make sure we change that to say character body 2D, just so we don't get confused. And that's only if you want your character to have that type of behavior. But I like the rigid body 2D, so I'm going to right click, go to change, and then type in rigid body 2D. Notice the icon changed to a rigid body 2D icon. So to avoid confusion, I will type in rigid body 2D. Let's see if there's anything else I want to make sure I do. Every game has a level, so we need to add the level to the game. Let's go down to our scenes and drag that up to game. So our game is going to have our level. Let's save that. Let's look at level. Level has an environment and a player. So when we're accessing the environment or the player, we're doing it on the level of, well, the level. The game can only have a level. The level can only have an environment and a player. An environment can have a series of blocks, which we're using as a tile map, and I'll show you that part in the next video. But for now, this is typically how I start my Godot project out, and then I build from there. So I'll show that in the next video. Thanks for watching.